Well, welcome back to our Bible study through the book of Habakkuk. Today in the second session, we're going to be in Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. So just to recap, in the first four verses, we saw Habakkuk issuing a complaint or a plea or a prayer to God to intervene with Judah because of their wickedness. They weren't adhering to the law, they were oppressing the righteous, they were acting wickedly, and Habakkuk is asking God why he would allow this and why he isn't doing anything about it. We saw that even though Habakkuk was close to God and was a devout follower of his, even he still had questions for God and complaints about the way God was handling, or in this situation, not handling, the situation in Judah. We saw Habakkuk cry out to God, asking why he doesn't intervene, why he doesn't do anything about the wickedness that he sees right in front of him. And as we continue into this next session, we see God's response to Habakkuk. So the first four verses were his plea or his complaint to God, and now moving into verse 5, we see God's response to him. So starting in verse 5 of chapter 1, it says this: "Look at the nations and observe, and be utterly astounded, for I am doing something in your days that you will not believe when you hear about it." So God's response to Habakkuk starts off with him sort of kind of turning the tables on Habakkuk. In the first few verses, we saw Habakkuk asking God to look at the wickedness and injustice that he sees. He's telling God to look at this wickedness, and here God is flipping the script on Habakkuk and saying, no, you look at what's going on. He's saying, I see what's going on. No, you look at what's going on, and you see what's happening. And his response is kind of strange, though, because he doesn't really answer Habakkuk's question. Habakkuk he's crying out about kind of these local issues that are happening in Judah and the wickedness that he sees kind of within the nation. But God responds with talking about international issues, so to speak. He's bringing up other nations. And before we continue with these verses, continue with God's response, it's important to note how easily this verse is taken out of context. The second half of Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 5, when read in isolation, sounds like God is about to do something just amazing for them. And when read out of context, and for us. That if we just read that I'm doing something in your days that you will not believe when you hear it. We just read that, or we just see that kind of quoted, and it's like, oh, God is about to do something for me that I won't be able to believe when I see it. He has such amazing plans for me and such great things, which he does, obviously, but that's not what he's saying here. That's not the point of what he's saying here in Habakkuk. If we read this without knowing what follows or what God is referring to, we can easily assume that this is kind of a really encouraging message to Habakkuk and a really encouraging message to us, and use it just as the verses of encouragement without actually looking at the full context of what's happening. However, if we continue reading in this chapter, we can see what God is actually talking about here. So he says, "Look at the nations and observe, be utterly astounded, for I am doing something in your days you will not believe when you hear about it." And then he continues in verse 6. He says, "Look, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter, impetuous nation that marches across the earth's open spaces to seize territories not its own." So now we start getting a peek into God's plan a little bit, and it isn't something that would have been very encouraging to Habakkuk or anybody else. God says that he's raising up the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, and God doesn't specify that he's raising up Babylon against them, but it's certainly implied here. Verse 6 and the following verses all focus on how powerful and fierce Babylon is. So God describes them as a bitter and impetuous nation. Another translation would call them ruthless and hasty. They were a cruel nation who was conquering much of Western Asia at the time at this alarming speed. At this incredible speed, they're just taking over nation after nation, or kingdom after kingdom. And Babylon would march on a nation, take whatever they wanted, take whatever they needed, and conquered region after region after region. So they're feared by everybody. And God is saying that this is who he's going to raise up against them. And in verse 7, he continues with a description of the Babylonian army. In chapter 1, verse 7, he says, "They are fierce and terrifying. Their views of justice and sovereignty stem from themselves." So God doesn't simply just tell Habakkuk that Babylon will rise up, but he goes into great detail about how their army, how intense their army is. And so this, I can imagine him listening to this being like, what? But he says that their views of justice and sovereignty stem from themselves. In other words, they're not subject to anybody else. that nobody tells them what to do or nobody has control over them, nobody rules over them. They set their own rules, which stem from their ruthlessness. So God is specifying this because Babylon was not under God's law like Israel was. They were the last people that you'd expect God to use, especially against his own people. They're described as fierce. The word that's translated as fierce can also be translated as dread-inspiring, and it's related to the term used for awe-inspiring. And the implication here is that it's shocking and awe-inspiring how horrifying the Babylonians are. They weren't just wicked people, but they were horrific. So he's going into all this great detail about these people that are going to be coming up against them. And this is about the least encouraging thing that you could possibly read right now. In fact, in the book of Jeremiah, we see the Babylonians also described there. It's described in Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 23. He says, they are cruel and they show no mercy. So this is not people that you want to be up against, but that's what God is saying is going to be happening here. And he continues in verse 8. He says, their horses are swifter than leopards and more fierce than wolves at night. Their horsemen charge ahead. Their horsemen come from distant lands. They fly like eagles, swooping to devour. So here God talks about their horses, which were a major tool in warfare and would have terrified the people of Judah because horses were less common in this region. So Judah was a hill country. So horses were less useful and they were more scarce there. So because of this, Babylon's horses were seen as a tool of war that they didn't have much experience with or much defense against. So he's saying, look at the tools they have for war that they're going to come up against you with that you can't do much about. Calling them swifter than leopards is obviously hyperbole, but it's just meant to indicate that their speed is something that the people of Judah would not be prepared for. And he goes on to say that they're more fierce than wolves at night. In this region, in the region of Judah, wolves hunted in the evening, meaning that this is when they're hungrier and more fierce because they hadn't eaten in a while. So God is comparing Babylon's horses to hungry and angry wolves that are on the hunt. And this phrase that their horsemen come from distant lands or afar is most likely a reference to their speed. They come from far away, they travel long distances, but they still come with the speed and ferocity of an eagle or of a bird of prey, which circles its prey before swooping in to kill. So keep in mind here as we're reading this, it might seem like, God, why are you going into so much detail? Like this seems almost like gratuitous how much detail you're going into Habakkuk, almost like rubbing salt on the wound of just reminding him how fierce they are. But keep in mind, God doesn't waste words. He doesn't say things without there being a point in what he's saying. And he isn't just being colorful for the sake of being colorful here. He is accurately describing the army and telling Habakkuk how intense his intervention into the wickedness of his people will be. It continues in verse 9. He says, all of them come to do violence. Their faces are set in determination. They gather prisoners like sand. Their whole purpose is violence, and they're determined to do so. They're determined to be violent. They gather up prisoners like sand. That's not only a reference to the amount of prisoners that they take, a vast amount, like taking up a scoop of sand, like imagining how many grains of sand are just there if you take up just a handful of sand. But it's also a reference to the ease in which they take prisoners. Like sand, they offer little to no resistance. There's no resistance if you just go and take up a scoop of sand. And the Babylonians are able to take prisoners as easy as a person taking a scoop of sand. And so God is just going on and on about about how fierce they are and how violent they are and how powerful they are. He continues in verse 10. He says, they mock kings and rulers are a joke to them. They laugh at every fortress and build siege ramps to capture it. So imagine for a second that this is being told to you. You cry out to God asking to intervene in the wickedness of your people or the wickedness that you see in kind of your nation or your society. And the response is not only that he's going to raise up an enemy, but then he goes on and on to describe how violent and fierce and terrifying this enemy is. Imagine what you would be thinking. Imagine what Habakkuk must be thinking at this time. See, nothing can stand against the Babylonian army, at least from their point of view, from Habakkuk's point of view and from most of the world's point of view at this time. Nothing can stand against the Babylonian army. Other rulers are a joke to them, and no other fortress stand a chance against them. The siege ramps that are mentioned here, what this is large ramps of dirt that an invading army would build when they attack a city. because there would be walls surrounding a city. There'd be walls, kind of like a fortress surrounding a city to protect them. So they'd build these large ramps of dirt that would allow soldiers to get up on and over the fortress walls. And we see here that any nation is vulnerable to Babylon, and their power is unmatched. So this is the most demoralizing thing probably that he could be hearing at this time. And then he finishes up in verse 11. He says, then they sweep by like the wind and pass through. They're guilty. Their strength is their God. So it's important to note that God says that they're guilty and that strength is their God. Although God is using the Babylonians, this doesn't mean that they were followers of God or that they worshiped him. In fact, they did the exact opposite. They worshiped themselves and they worshiped their own strength. And God ends his response with kind of a reference to their godlessness, which would likely cause some confusion as to why God would use this awful nation to enact his will. He's specifying that they don't follow him, but yet God is going to use them anyways. And that ends God's first response. Habakkuk cries out about the wickedness of the people of Judah, and God responds by telling him that he will raise up Babylon against them. And not just that, but he goes on and on about how scary and awful the Babylonians are. And this is probably hard for us to wrap our heads around, especially since we're ending today's study here, and we're not continuing into the next session until the next session. And just like last time, we did in verses 1 through 4, we leave this issue unresolved as we continue this study. And so as we end this section, as we end God's first response to Habakkuk, there are three things that we can see that we can take away from God's response here. Despite how kind of demoralizing it might sound, or despite how defeating it probably was to Habakkuk, there are still things that we can take away from his response, from his first response. And the first one is this, that God can use anybody to accomplish his mission. The Babylonians are literally the last people that they would have expected God to use, especially against his own people. However, we see God use them. And this doesn't mean that they were godly or that he approved of what they were doing, but we can see that God is able to use anybody to accomplish his mission, even those that would be the last that we'd expect. See, how often do we think that God will only use us once we have it all together? That God can only use us once we get our own stuff straightened out, once we get over whatever issues we have, then God can use us. That we have to fix everything on our own before God will be willing to use us. But we can see here that that's simply not the case. God can and will use who he wants, whoever he wants, and it's not about what we do, but it's about what God can do through us. See, God can use anybody to accomplish his mission. If he could use the Babylonians at this time, he could use anybody. Second thing we see here is that God always responds. We just might not like the response. God always responds. God always listens. We just might not like the response that we get. Sometimes it doesn't feel like God's listening or that he hears our cries. However, he always hears and he always responds. We just might not like the response. As we'll see in these next sessions, Habakkuk obviously doesn't like God's response, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong and that he doesn't even accuse him of being wrong. And how often do we think that God hasn't responded or hasn't heard us, when in reality, he has responded and is working in the situation that we're pleading God to work in? It's just that he isn't doing things the way that we want him to do it. See, God always listens. He always responds. But just because he responds, it doesn't mean that he responds according to our will, but he responds according to his own. He always responds. We just might not like the response. Then the third and final thing we can see here is that God has complete control. God has complete control. His use of Babylon shows us that he has complete control over every situation. There's no way that the Babylonians could be used if God didn't have control. I love the way one commentator puts this issue. He says, God allows tyrants to spring up and flourish for a little while, but they become guilty by the abuse of their power, and like a plant before it's firmly rooted, God blows on them and they wither. See, just because God is using this godless and evil nation in this case does not mean that he doesn't have control over them. God has complete control, even when things seem out of control. Both in this situation and in our own lives, I'm sure the state of things made Habakkuk feel like the people of Judah were out of control, that the nation was out of control, and that's why he's crying out to God. And hearing that the solution was for Babylon to come in probably made him feel like the situation was even more out of control, that there's even less he could do about it, that there's even less control over the situation. However, despite how out of control the situation may feel, God has complete control. Just because things don't work out the way we want or expect doesn't mean that God doesn't have control. He has complete control over the situation in Judah, over Habakkuk's situation, over the Babylonians, and just like that, he has complete control over every situation that you're facing, every situation that I'm facing, every situation that we feel like is completely out of control, that we can't see a way out of. God has complete control over. And that's what we see in Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 5 through 11.
Hey, thanks so much for checking out this video. We upload new videos every week to help encourage you in your faith in Jesus. So be sure to subscribe to this channel so that you never miss a thing.